Good morning, family. Welcome to the Marshfield Church of Christ. Here at the Marshfield Church of Christ, we are committed to glorifying God and uplifting one another through worship, spiritual growth, outreach, fellowship, and service to the community. We believe that we achieve that mission by loving God and by loving one another. So we continue this morning in our journey to Jerusalem in Luke chapter 11. Luke chapter 11 is kind of a timely thing to be discussing because I don't know how much you keep up with these sort of things, but this is my news. There have been a couple of things that have happened in the last week or so that have I won't say change the landscape of Christendom, but they've been major things, okay? One of them is that the author of the book, I Stopped Dating, I don't know if any of you have heard of that, came out and renounced his Christianity. And he said that he's no longer going to be practicing. He felt that the life that he was living was hypocritical because he and his wife were getting a divorce. And the things that he was telling people to do were no longer true of himself. So at least he admitted to it, but he decided that he no longer could do what he had been doing, and at this point has left his religious tradition. Another one that you may have heard of is happening right now. The reason I know about it is because some of my brother lives about 15 minutes away from the church where this is happening. There is a church, I won't say which tradition, but they're in the hiring process for a new minister. And one of the things that has come out during this, one of the gentlemen who was up for the job has been accused by two women who were 18 at the time of being sexually abused by one of the men who was up for the job while he was acting as a youth minister in that particular facility. I think it was in Indiana at that time. If we think back to not all that long ago, there was the huge controversy between priests, choosing my words, doing things with some of the young men who had volunteered that were not appropriate. All of these things are sort of lumped together, fairly or unfairly, on people who are religious. I noted a few weeks ago that one of the big differences and one of the big pushes from younger people is actually the generation after mine, that something they find important is this idea of authenticity. Now, we're going to talk about this more toward the end of the lesson, but my biggest issue with using those types of terms, they assume that authenticity and reverence for things are opposites. For some people, wearing a three-piece suit, having their hair really nice, and wearing a nice watch, that is the real them. That is authentic. But we assume sometimes that if you don't wear shorts, you're not being authentic. But Jesus here is addressing a similar issue to what we have seen today. People in power in the religious community acting in such a way that is contrary to what they are supposed to be standing for. This has all started out with this interesting thing that kind of sets off the conversation, where Jesus decides he's not going to, quote unquote, wash. Just kind of an aside, you notice that he uses the word wash initially, Luke does here, and then he uses cleanse after that. It's because it's two different words. The word wash is actually baptizo, and in this context it meant to make something ritually pure. And that was a practice that was pretty common even before baptism was introduced in the way that we use it today. But there was a big difference between cleanliness or uncleanliness, I guess would be the better way to put this, and dirtiness. Just because something was unclean didn't necessarily mean it was dirty, and vice versa. So this wasn't that Jesus didn't like to wash his hands before he ate. Let's get that straight. It had nothing to do with this. And the whole thing that they were doing really didn't have anything to do with cleanliness at all, at least not in the way that we think about it. It was ritual purification. And the actual act didn't make them really any more clean than they were before they started it. And that's one of the big things I like to point out about this, is this was a show. The whole thing was a show. It really didn't change their physical cleanliness, and it obviously didn't change the cleanliness of their hearts. They were doing this to make people see them as people who were holy. This could be the fish on your back of your car. I mean, that's kind of what this was. And Jesus follows this up by saying in verse 39, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also?" So Jesus here is giving a commentary on the state of their hearts. He says, you make things look good. You make things look like you've got everything together. You're behaving the way you're supposed to be, and that you are holy. But in reality, your heart couldn't be any farther from it. So Jesus proceeds to give two sets of woes. If you notice first, the sets of the woes are woes for the Pharisees. He's got three here. The first one we see down here in verse 42. It says, "You tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God." So, this was something I ran across. The word rue comes from the same Aramaic word that dill does. So when you look at Matthew's account, he takes this as dill, and that's the way that he probably translates it, that this conversation was originally in Aramaic. It was commanded for people to tithe their possessions. There's a couple different references to this. This seems to be Leviticus 27. I've also seen people use, it's Deuteronomy 14 as another possible reference of what this is talking about. There was such a high respect for the law at that time that they went as far as making sure that whenever they were giving their tithes, they were checking their spices, they were checking everything that they had, and they made sure that they gave a tenth of that also. But Jesus says, look at the second part there, you neglect justice and the love of God. Whenever we think about the ways that we're supposed to obey God, there's some things that are foundational. Loving God is probably the most foundational thing that there is. Whenever Jesus was asked what's the greatest commandment, that's what he points to. He says, loving God with all your soul, mind, strength, and heart. All of those things, they all come together. You got to do all of them. That's how much you should love God. That's foundational. If you remember, Jesus in John chapter 13 says, "You will see my disciples and you will know them by the love that they have for one another." So it's the mark of the way that you know you are seeing a Christian or a disciple of Jesus. That's what you look for, the love that they have for one another. The Pharisees had chosen to use the things that they did and the outward things to be the mark of what they were. I mentioned this before. A lot of times we tend to group people in the New Testament as you are either a Pharisee or a Sadducee. And I've also mentioned there was another group called the Essenes. But most people, probably about 90% of the population, didn't fall into either of those groups. They were Jews, and they didn't have a problem with that. But the Pharisees used this ritual cleansing as one of the markers of were you in or were you out? And I'm convinced that the people who were sitting there and the people that were witnessing this that weren't necessarily part of the Pharisees were very aware of these type of things going on. But at the end of this woe, Jesus does point something out that I think is very important for us to keep in mind. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Jesus never says, you don't need to worry about doing the tithes, you just need to focus on love and justice. What he says is, those are important, but this is more important. It takes all of these things together. His next woe is found there in verse 43. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. You've probably heard about the phylacteries and those type of things that the Jewish people at the time used to really show, hey, I am spiritual. I saw this on Facebook this week, and I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It was a company, and it said, should we put a fish on our logo to let people know that we're a Christian organization? And it had Jesus talking to him and says, why don't you act in a Christian way so that you don't need the fish? The people at that time who wanted to be holy, or at least give the presentation that they were holy, would do things outwardly, and they would neglect the things inwardly. They would work at different things to make sure that people knew how holy they were. They cared about the type of reputation that they had, and they loved for people to say, hey, Rabbi. It made them feel good about themselves. That was their end, though. What they wanted was the praise. There's nothing wrong with knowing a lot about Scripture. In fact, I highly encourage it. There's nothing wrong about wanting people to think of you as a Christian. I highly encourage that. The problem is that your goal? Do you want people to think about you as a Christian to improve your reputation? I'd like to think that nobody that I have personally met within the churches of Christ has that kind of attitude. I'd like to think that. I have seen in other traditions that does play itself out. That they are more concerned with what they can get because of their religion rather than what they can do for God. We can never slip into that trap. The last one here, the last woe for the Pharisees, to me is the most interesting one. It says, woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it. Now, unless you look back, this particular insult doesn't seem all that bad until you look a little bit deeper into what he's saying. Now, as far as I know, I've never walked over an unmarked grave. It's not marked. I wouldn't know. To me, walking over an unmarked grave doesn't really mean a whole lot. It's just one more place to step as far as I'm concerned. The problem is, under the law of Moses, if you had contact with a corpse, you were considered unclean. So what he's saying here is, you people are dead inside. And by people coming into contact with you, they become unclean. As you can imagine, they weren't too happy about that. So then you have this other group step up. And this transition verse in verse 45 I find really interesting. It says, one of the lawyers answered, "Teacher, in saying this you insult us also." Now, in our culture, when somebody says, "Hey, this is offensive to me," usually the response is, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. What I actually meant was da-da-da-da-da." Instead of reeling it back Jesus actually presses harder whenever he starts rebuking the lawyers here. Now, the term lawyer is probably not the best word for this, because the type of, like, an attorney that we have today is not all that similar to what they had then. They didn't really have the same way that we think of as the court system wasn't arranged the same way. A lawyer was more close to like a scholar. The word is nomikos. Now, some of you who have taken my class might recognize the word nomos. Nomos is the word for law. If you take any word in Greek that has an ikos in it, you're deriving it from another word. So a nomikos means someone who is learned in a particular field, this particular one, the law. Now, an interesting thing about this word is it's actually an adjective. It's a descriptive word. So you use it to describe somebody or someone who is well-versed, well-studied in the law. In the New Testament, it's only used as an adjective, as a descriptive word, once. You can find it in a lot of legal writing outside of the Bible, but even whenever it's used outside the Bible, a lot of times it's referencing Jewish practices. And if you look in Josephus' writings, this term is used to talk about these people. They were sort of like the academy at the time. They were the type of people that if you had a really big question, that's who you went to. And whenever we see this description here of the Pharisees and the lawyers, it's kind of like the preachers and the teachers at universities. That's kind of the separation that we see here. And this lawyer says, you're talking about us too. And Jesus basically says, why, yes, I am. In fact, he says in verse 46, woe to you lawyers, you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burden with one of your fingers. Now, he's likely referencing things having to do with the law and purity laws, particularly, that we were talking about before. If you look at the Mishnah, which seems to be written by this group of people, and they collected these laws into an extra set of laws, almost a quarter, 25% of the Mishnah is about purity rituals and cleansing, and most of them are in reference to before you eat something. Now, if you take and look at the Old Testament, particularly Leviticus and Deuteronomy, some degree numbers, if you compare the amount of ritual purity laws to the number of laws that there were total, it's much less than 25%. They have taken this, and as they said, they've added an extra burden on people. But because these people are more or less withdrawn from society, they never have to deal with it. It's really easy to make a law when you're never going to be affected by it. They talk about the healthcare laws, how a lot of the people in Congress who passed these laws, they asked them, they polled them, would you be willing to go on this particular plan yourself? And my understanding was 96% of people said no. Isn't that a little bit odd? You're saying, yes, this is good enough for the rest of the people, but you yourself are not willing to do it. Verse 47, woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you're witnesses and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for you killed them and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom you will kill and persecute. So the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. Now, this phrase here that Jesus uses is kind of interesting. Whenever he says from Abel to Zechariah, Whenever we look at the Bible, we think of it from Genesis to Malachi. Their Bible, the one that they would have been using, was arranged from Genesis to 2nd Chronicles. And if you notice, the first murder in the Bible was Abel. The last murder, which is in 2nd Chronicles chapter 24, is Zechariah. So basically what Jesus says here, anybody that you read about being murdered in the Old Testament, their blood is on your hands. You get upset that your fathers killed these people, and it mentions elsewhere, you say that, if I was back then, I wouldn't have done that. Jesus here points out, he says, you're the exact type of people who would have done that. You don't want anything that would mess up the situation that you have going. You care more about the form than you care about the meaning. You care about what things look like. You care about control. You don't care about God. He ends his woes in verse 52. Woe to lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who are entering. We are very blessed to live in a situation that we do. I actually just got this Bible, I think 3 weeks ago, and it's really good because I left my one I normally preach from in Tennessee whenever we visited. I now can pre-order a Bible if I like how it looks, and it'll arrive the day that it's supposed to come out. Isn't that kind of neat? If you get on your phone, you probably have access to, my guess is, 50 decent translations without doing a whole lot of work. At the time, you were lucky to have one copy of the Scriptures in a town. And they were all usually kept in the synagogue under lock and key. And some of these people would restrict those people who had access to the Scriptures. I was talking to the young men this morning about a gentleman by the name of Savonarola. Savonarola was a monk who lived in Florence. And he's important in kind of the pre-Reformation movement. And some people have said that, this is a weird way to phrase this, that Savonarola laid the egg that Luther hatched. I think you could have picked some better verbiage, but it gives you an idea of his role. Savonarola had the guts to tell the church at the time, we should make the Scriptures available for the common people to read. And if you go to Florence today, there's this really large medallion, and I believe it's made out of bronze, and you can stand on it. And that was the spot where Savonarola was burned alive for suggesting that. If you control the information, it's easy to control people. And that was one of the major things that they did. If you tell people this is what the law says, and they never have a chance to investigate it themselves, they don't know the difference. Which brings us to, what about us? Do we say one thing and we look the other way? Are we two-faced? Is the person who's sitting in the pew today different from the person that's out in the world Monday through Saturday? Authenticity is important. One of the biggest things that Jesus did during his life, and probably the one that ended up getting him killed, was addressing hypocrisy. There's some very large trees in the redwood forest particularly, but around that area there's large trees in general. It's easy for them to grow. And apparently there's this method. My grandfather used to log, so I should ask him about this, that if you hit it, you can tell by the way that you hit it with a hammer or something else kind of blunt if the tree is rotten on the inside or not. Because the problem is that whenever you look at a big tall tree, especially if you don't know what you're doing, the big tall tree, as long as it has leaves on it and it's doing what it's supposed to, if it's rotten on the inside, it looks the same as the ones that are around it. But on the inside, it's weak. On the inside, it's ready to fall. The inside is the reality. The outside is a facade. Is that how you live your life? Do you have a way that you display yourself that's different from what you actually are? You notice Jesus was always very kind to people who struggled with sin. You think about the woman at the well. You think about the woman caught in adultery. He was willing to help those people who were willing to ask for help. He was harsh on the people who thought that they were righteous and were different on the inside than the way that they displayed themselves on the outside. Is that you this morning? If it is, I challenge you, clean the inside of the cup as well as the outside. If you have any need, please come together. We'll stand as we sing.